It's Sunday evening in Washington. It's Monday afternoon here in Melbourne, Australia. Shawn, great to see you again. Great to chat. We normally have a bit of a longer hiatus between our conversations, but it feels like we could talk every day about tariffs at the moment. Where are we right now? Is there anything in the news cycle I've missed in the last day? What's happening as we speak?
There was a lot that happened over the weekend. There were announcements that happened Friday night that looked like electronics products were going to be largely carved out, excluded
Hmm.
from the tariffs. It looked like that was going to include things like computers, smartphones, semiconductor equipment. There was a list of HTS goods that qualified. And then as the weekend progressed, even into Sunday night, it looked like those exclusions have changed. There were some clear interviews with President Trump as well as some of his advisors that suggest that there are no products that will be saved from tariffs.
Yeah. Yeah, and the implication was that those exemptions on smartphones would be short-lived. It feels like there are some very substantial companies in the US that rely on China to make smartphones. If they were to move them elsewhere, it's going to happen very, very slowly. So, there are certainly issues there. I think the biggest surprise in the last week was the 90-day pause on the reciprocal tariffs. That seemed quite sudden, but also quite a long pause. That was a surprise to, I think, everybody outside of the US. Was it a surprise? It seemed to be a surprise to the market and the Fed as well.
I think so. I think every day is a surprise when it comes
Mm,
to tariffs. I think every minute is a surprise. Certainly, we had a lot of surprises over the weekend. I think what we see the administration doing with respect to electronics is moving away from a reciprocal tariff approach where it's designated by country and
mm,
focusing on a sectorial approach. I think why that's important for electronics is because it means that it isn't enough to just say, okay, we're not going to import from China, we're not going to import from India. And you have seen a diversification, which we have talked about on this program, happen. We've been decoupling from China. We've been diversifying in Southeast Asia.
yeah.
Places like Vietnam, India have been big winners. Mexico's been a big winner. But by all indications over the weekend, it seems like a sectorial approach suggests it doesn't matter where they're being imported, that they will still face tariffs. President Trump said on Air Force One as he was returning to Washington from Florida tonight, Sunday night here in Washington, that he would be announcing those rates. Initially, he said this week. Then he also seemed to clarify and said Monday. So we'll be
Yeah.
potentially looking at tariffs that will impact semiconductors and perhaps more broadly electronics on Monday, and if not Monday, perhaps later this week, this sectorial approach. But it also appears that the administration will take they're going to take an approach around 232, Section 232, which is these national security investigations. Normally, those take about 270 days to complete. President Trump has suggested that this might be an accelerated timeline, but those typically have a period for comments where trade
Mm.
associations, companies, and others can make comments about the potential ruling. So normally, there's a process around Section 232 national security investigations that take almost a year. Typically take 270 days or so. But this administration has been moving very quickly, obviously,
Yeah.
and things have shifted and changed on a day-to-day basis.
In terms of its speed. And while you're saying that, I'm thinking I need to get this show edited and out pretty much right after we finished talking. The market response last week was very much up and down and up and down. What did it look like as the week closed out, and what is it going to look like, do you think, as the markets open tomorrow morning?
Well, we've seen the Asian markets already opening, and initially it looked like the technology sector was responding
Yeah,
positively. I think,
yeah,
as you would expect, to the what looked like in indication that semiconductors and broadly the electronics industry would be saved from tariffs and they would be coming in. But that has all, I think, unwound in the last 12 to 24 hours.
mm,
And so I think the market is still going to be jittery. I think that there is a lot of uncertainty. I think sentiment has declined, notably not just among consumers, but also among executives. And it's very hard to turn that quickly. It's very hard
mm.
to change their mind. So I think the probability of a recession has risen notably. I think
Again,
it's still very high. I think there's a very high probability that the U.S. is in recession in 2025. Probably if I had to pick a time period starting in Q3, perhaps a shallow recession, but a recession nonetheless. Now that isn't inevitable. That could be reversed, but it will take not only a reversal of the policy, but it'll also take clarity that drives back positive sentiment and that
yeah.
improves confidence in the economy.
Yeah, and that lack of confidence in the economy, that comes from the variability in the tariffs. It comes from all kinds of different things, but it comes also from a concern about inflation, that these tariffs are going to drive up the cost of goods. Is that the general feeling in the market? And is that
I
also the feel of the Fed that's got to make a decision on interest rates shortly?
Yeah, now we did see some Fed members come out Friday and say, "We're watching the markets. We've got you. We're gonna move in and we'll make adjustments as needed. We're watching the situation closely," which was the first time that we have seen the Fed say we're paying attention to
Yeah.
to what's happening in the markets right now. If you look at other previous announcements, last week we had unemployment, or we received employment numbers and unemployment rate. We had a pretty good employment report in the U.S. for March, and you saw Chair Powell say, look, we're going to continue to take a wait and see approach. There's a lot of uncertainties. And so I think that also made the market nervous that the Fed wasn't willing to jump in and
Mm.
intercede if needed because they were so anchored to what was happening in inflation. I think the Fed has opened up that parameter a little bit, and they're going to jump in if things start to cool more rapidly than they anticipate. I think they are going to have to balance what's happening with inflation. But I
Yeah.
think what's really driving the gyration in the market is the constant changing of the wind, and
Mm.
investors not sure how to interpret it because they're not sure how businesses are going to interpret it. And ultimately, what tends to typically drive recessions is a major shift in business investment. So you see a shift in hiring, you see a shift in CapEx, you see those
Mm.
type of things happen. So if business leaders feel uncertain about the situation, if they're not sure what the environment is going to look like, they're going to just pause investment. And if that happens at a large enough level, that will ultimately be what pushes us into recession.
Yeah, my sense, I spoke to a couple of leaders in European EMS last week, and both thought the dust was settled. We were waiting for the dust to settle. It was very much a wait and see approach, and that pragmatic approach, but that was certainly delaying the decision making of their customers. It was delaying the decision making they had outside of the investment that they'd already got planned. So it was kind of slowing things down. When you look at what's the current administration is trying to do with the tariffs, do you think there are issues that are much more significant than others? I mean, is a lot of it about China? Is it a lot of it about specific segments? In some ways, the relationship with Europe seems to have settled a bit, and Europe took off their retrospective tariffs that were a response to the reciprocal tariffs. So there's a pause as a result of the pause. What do you think are the big battles out there in the trade war at the moment?
I think some of it is this drive to accelerate the decoupling from China.
Hmm.
I think some of the motivations seem mixed, and even officials within the administration seem to mention different things at different times. Um, I think one of the things we saw around electronics over the weekend was an indication that the tariffs are designed to incentivize domestic production.
Mm.
So with semiconductors, can we create a tariff regime that will drive notable and meaningful investment in the electronic supply chain within the U.S.? And
Yeah,
so I think that made clear one of the motivations, especially around electronics, is not to punish manufacturers who rely on supply chains outside of the U.S., but to really motivate and to incentivize domestic production. So
yeah. And
now
that's a fine line, isn't it? That's a bit of
it
a
is
balance
it
you
is a
have to
fine
do.
line. It is a fine line because even domestic producers rely heavily on components that are produced elsewhere. And so, we tend to look at tariffs and we think it's all about foreign countries, foreign companies. But
Mm.
at the end of the day, uh, tariffs on things like PCBs or other materials that are used by domestic producers in the US are still going to see a price rise. And so even electronics made in the US will be more expensive because the components that they rely on and the
Yeah.
inputs that they rely on will be more expensive.
Yeah. And when you look at the work IPC is doing in Washington, it really is a question of, providing as much clarity to the administration and helping the administration to understand how complex and how multi-layered the supply chain is as you go down even through, scope one and scope two and scope three all the way down. It's a very complex supply chain. That's a big and important job for Chris and Rich and the team that really deal directly with that.
Definitely, and they are working night and day on
Yeah.
these issues, and honestly, they had been prior to, um, the rise in tariffs. I think that the ultimate goal are, all the goals are probably generally aligned, and that's
Mm.
to strengthen electronics manufacturing in the U.S., also to strengthen it globally within, the markets around the world that IPC services. And at the same time, in strengthening those markets, you don't want to inadvertently weaken them because of the punishment, because of the
The
policies that
short
you're
term, yeah.
putting into place. And
Yeah.
so we need clarity and certainty in order to drive investment. And so I think it's important to recognize what the end goal is and then to assess, are these type of policies going to help us achieve what we're trying to do? And in the case of tariffs, I think there's a lot of questions about how effective they will be at ultimately incentivizing new investment. And then secondly, a changing policy that is gyrating and changing from day to day or hour to hour can be a very challenging environment to drive new investment. Companies are simply going
Yeah.
to wait and see what the landscape looks like.
Yeah. Yeah, it's driving anxiety, and anxiety doesn't drive good planning or investment. The last question I just wanted to ask or consider with you is I'm in a very privileged position that I get to speak to leadership in the US, but I also get to speak to leadership in Europe and leadership in Asia. I spoke recently to the CEO of an EMS company in Hong Kong, and they were talking about investment. Should they be buying something in the US? Should they be focusing their sales effort outside of the US so they're less dependent on the US market? When I look at the conversations I've had with Europeans, it's, well, how much of our business that we do in the US are we fulfilling in the US? And if we're not fulfilling it in the US and we're fulfilling it from somewhere else, how small and how significant a part of our business is that? And should we be focusing on other markets? So I almost sense there's a view that people have got to work around this when they're thinking about their global trade. And there's a risk that the US becomes a little bit isolated. And it's like, well, we can't see any clarity on that problem. Let's push that to one side for a minute and focus on maybe a better trading relationship between China and Europe, or a better trading relationship between other Asian partners and other markets. Obviously, the US is the largest of the consumer markets, but it's not the only one. How do you see that? And is that a concern? Is there an awareness in Washington that could happen?
I think both things can be true. If you're a company that's operating outside of the US, you're clearly looking at strengthening your markets and your relationships around the globe. You see, President Xi is in Southeast Asia this week as he is looking to strengthen relationships with others in the region, perhaps seeing them as important end markets that he can help serve so that they can continue to grow their manufacturing base in China, even when they're losing some of what they might have historically allocated to the US. So I think that certainly can be true if you're operating outside the US. And at the same time, the US is a very large market for many industries, not just the end market for consumers. Obviously, it's a very large aerospace and defense industries. You've got a large auto industry. And so you have a lot still of manufacturing in the US that if you're making inputs into manufacturing that you're going to want to serve. And so I don't think that you can ignore the market.
No.
And think that, oh, the rest of the world is going to provide us all the growth that we need. I think both cases will be true. And especially when it comes to electronics, the integration with electronics globally, I think, is perhaps more pronounced than any other industry. So the need to have strong relationships globally to maintain those ties and those networks, I think, will be key, even in a world where the tariffs create a tremendous amount of uncertainty and even create headwinds, for certain segments of the market.
Yeah, again, it's a balancing act on their part. The news cycle is quicker than I've ever seen at the moment, and it's an interesting challenge. I'm sure we'll be talking again very soon, both on and off the record, Shawn. Thanks so much for your time today. Safe travels back home, and we'll chat soon. Thank you.